Spock's two Star Trek heartbreaks explain why the Vulcan never pursued love again. Despite his famously logical exterior, Spock has had several serious romantic relationships across Star Trek canon. In Star Trek: Strange New Worlds, Lieutenant Spock, Ethan Peck, has a short-lived romance with nurse Christine Chapel, Jess Bush, and Spock's fraught engagement and divorce with T'Pring, Gia Santu. In Star Trek, the original series, Commander Spock, Leonard Nimoy, rebuffs lingering romantic overtures from Nurse Chapel, Majel Barrett Roddenberry, and is dumped by T'Pring, Arlene Martel. Through Strange New Worlds, audiences have a chance to see Spock's relationships with both T'Pring and Nurse Chapel at their most healthy, even if the canon established by Star Trek, the original series, means that they can only end badly. And indeed, both of Spock's breakups are messy. In fact, it is arguably the pain that Spock experiences after these breakups that leads to him never marrying after T'Pring. After all, other logical Vulcans, like Spock's own father Sarek, marry multiple times. Spock, on the other hand, is a permanent bachelor by the time of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Nurse Chapel broke Spock's heart in Star Trek: Strange New Worlds musical episode. In Star Trek, the original series, Commander Spock and Nurse Chapel's relationship is portrayed as largely one-sided. For the most part, Nurse Chapel pines for Spock, who at best suggests in Amok Time that they might have had something together under other circumstances. In Strange New Worlds, however, Spock and Nurse Chapel have a strong and supportive friendship that grows, over time, into romance. The budding romantic feelings that Nurse Chapel experiences in Spock Amok allow a softer aspect of Spock's character to take center stage. Spock and Chapel's relationship comes crashing down in Strange New Worlds musical episode, Subspace Rhapsody. Nurse Chapel ends her relationship with Spock on her own terms. Whereas in Star Trek, the original series, Spock rejects Nurse Chapel. In Strange New Worlds, Nurse Chapel takes the reins. Lieutenant Spock is clearly hurt by this rejection, and that pain might go a long way to explaining why, by the time of TOS, he is largely closed off to the possibility of romance. Unfortunately for Lieutenant Spock, Nurse Chapel's rejections are going to keep coming. The timeline of Strange New Worlds keeps moving closer to Star Trek, the original series, and Nurse Chapel's engagement with Dr. Roger Corby, Michael Strong. As such, any lingering romantic feelings that Spock might have for Nurse Chapel are doomed by Star Trek canon. After all, by the end of Strange New Worlds Season 2, Nurse Chapel is on her way to a fellowship with Dr. Corby. Nurse Chapel and Dr. Corby's engagement might serve as the ultimate rejection that closes Spock off to romance with humans. Star Trek II's Amok Time made Spock decide to permanently remain single, both in Strange New Worlds and in Star Trek. The original series, Spock's primary romantic interest is not Nurse Chapel, but T'Pring. Spock and T'Pring bonded in childhood, and by the time of both Strange New Worlds and TOS, they are engaged. In Strange New Worlds, the couple's relationship starts healthy but quickly devolves. Central to their conflict is the fact that Spock feels like he is not Vulcan enough for T'Pring, whereas T'Pring feels like Spock does not trust her. As with Nurse Chapel, T'Pring rejects Spock in Strange New Worlds Season 2, Episode 5, Charades, suggesting that they ought to take time apart. Spock's emotional journey in Star Trek has always been one of the most complex and compelling arcs in the franchise. As a half-human, half-Vulcan character, Spock embodies the constant struggle between logic and emotion. This inner conflict is especially evident in his experiences with love and heartbreak, which, though few and far between, have shaped his attitude toward relationships and emotional vulnerability for the rest of his life. Spock's two major heartbreaks in Star Trek explain why the Vulcan never pursued love again, leaving a lasting impact on his character and the stories around him. The first heartbreak, Layla Kalomi. Spock's first heartbreak comes in the Star Trek, the original series episode titled This Side of Paradise. In this episode, the Enterprise crew is investigating a colony on Omicron Ceti 3, where the colonists should have perished due to radiation. Instead, they find the inhabitants alive and well, including Layla Kalomi, a former lover of Spock's. Layla had once been deeply in love with Spock, but he had been unable to reciprocate her feelings due to his Vulcan commitment to suppressing emotion. However, on Omicron Ceti 3, the colonists have been exposed to spores from native plants that suppress rationality and induce a state of euphoria, effectively removing emotional barriers. Spock, under the influence of these spores, allows himself to feel emotions, including love, for the first time in his adult life. With the spores clouding his judgment, Spock falls in love with Layla, allowing himself to experience the depth of affection he had once denied. For a brief moment, Spock seems happy, embracing the human side of himself that he has always tried to suppress. He smiles, laughs, and openly expresses love for Layla in a way he never could before. However, this happiness is short-lived. Once Captain Kirk breaks the spore's control over Spock, the Vulcan reverts to his logical, emotion-suppressing self. This moment is a profound heartbreak for both Spock and Layla. Spock is forced to confront the reality that his emotions, while they may have brought him happiness, are incompatible with the discipline of logic that defines him as a Vulcan. He cannot sustain a relationship with Layla or anyone else while maintaining his identity as a Vulcan. The heartbreak for Layla is just as deep, as she loses the chance to be with the man she loves, even though she knows he cannot love her in the same way. Spock's experience with Layla leaves him with a bitter realization. Love for him is fleeting and unsustainable. The emotional vulnerability required to maintain a relationship goes against the very core of his Vulcan training. This heartbreak plants the seed that love, while tempting, is not a path Spock can follow if he is to stay true to his Vulcan heritage. The second heartbreak, Zarabeth. Spock's second major heartbreak comes in the Star Trek, the original series episode, All Our Yesterdays. In this episode, Spock, Dr. McCoy, and Captain Kirk are sent back in time to different periods of a dying planet's history. Spock and McCoy find themselves trapped in an ice age, where they meet Zarabeth, a beautiful woman who has been exiled to this time period. As they struggle to survive, Spock begins to experience strange changes in his behavior. The further back in time they go, the more Spock's Vulcan characteristics revert to those of his ancient ancestors, who were more emotional and less reliant on logic. In this state, Spock begins to develop feelings for Zarabeth. Unlike his previous experience with Layla, this time Spock's emotions arise naturally, not as a result of external manipulation. He forms a deep connection with Zarabeth, drawn to her strength, isolation, and vulnerability. For a short time, it seems as though Spock might finally allow himself to embrace the emotional side of his nature and pursue a relationship. However, the situation is doomed from the start. Zarabeth is permanently trapped in the past, while Spock and McCoy must return to their own time. Spock's heartbreak with Zarabeth is arguably even more devastating than his experience with Layla because this time, he does not have the excuse of external influences controlling his emotions. His feelings for Zarabeth are genuine, and he is forced to leave her behind, knowing that they can never be together. The loss of Zarabeth drives home a harsh truth for Spock. Even when his emotions are real, they lead only to pain and suffering. He cannot reconcile his duty to logic and his commitment to the principles of Vulcan stoicism with the emotional turmoil that love brings. The lasting impact. These two heartbreaks fundamentally shape Spock's attitude toward love for the rest of his life. His experiences with Layla and Zarabeth both highlight the deep incompatibility between his Vulcan logic and the emotional vulnerability required to pursue romantic relationships. Each time he allows himself to feel love, it ends in heartbreak, forcing him to confront the limitations of his dual heritage. While Spock is half human, his Vulcan side ultimately wins out, as he chooses to suppress his emotions in favor of a logical path.